Great, I think we will kick off. So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today, particularly on this lovely Monday morning. As you will likely know by now, or if you don't, I'm Laura Simonik. I'm the Principal Advisor here on Climate Action, and I also manage the Climate Leaders Coalition. So just wanted to provide a quick overview of what today's session is, which you'll see up on your screens already. So as you know, this is a building and construction chapter workshop in which we'll focus on the development of that versus what is in the ERP document. So what we'll do is, in a moment, I'll pass over to Toby Stevenson, who will give a presentation of an overview of the chapter as circulated last Monday in the draft. And then we'll open the floor to the members to have a discussion and answer any Q&A on the chapter as it currently stands. Would really welcome any feedback, in particular, if there's anything that you would like changed or would like to see more of, or in general more of, please let us know. And so now what I'll do is I'll pass over to Toby, and he'll lead us through a presentation on this. Thank you.
Good morning, it's nice to see everyone. I'm actually a double act, Jeff Smith, who's about to reveal himself. There's Jeff.
Hey, Jeff.
Jeff Smith from DETA. I'm from SAPRE, and we have been working on the energy and the industry and the building and construction sectors together. I'm going to share a presentation. And I have seemed to have set it. Right, that's the slide there. So I'm to take you through what we've written in the draft submission, but just a little bit of background here. So building and construction. So it's about design, it's about the materials, it's about well-being, and it's about reducing the amount of emissions that go into the building and subsequently maintain them. There's a list of things there that the government is doing now. Building for Climate Change program, the government leading the way. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. The construction sector accord, there's some examples of businesses that are listed in the government's document. And reducing demand for fossil fuels in building. The government leading the way is a series of programs, and they're listed there. The Carbon Neutral Government Program, the Neighbours NZ, there's the government procurement of its own buildings, Kaingaroa large redevelopment, and the Kaingaroa waste minimisation scheme, and the Warmer Kiwi homes. What the submission, what SPC and CLC submission should do is say, given all of that, there is more that government can do and should signal in the emissions reduction plan. They have already listed this fine list of things that they are going to do to improve the emissions that are used in creating the buildings, dismantling buildings, and living in buildings, living and working in buildings. And again, we need to talk about those in terms of what more detail should the emissions reduction plan eventually contain. I've got two horrendous slides, and I apologise on behalf of the author of the questions in advance. But these are 2 pages of questions in building and construction. And we can write to those questions, or we can write to all the programs and say, this is what more you should do. And so there you see question number 70. Government could improve the energy efficiency of buildings by introducing mandatory participation in the energy performance program. What do you think? Help building and construction sector reduce emissions from other sectors, such as what could government do to help the building and construction sector reduce emissions from other sectors, such as energy, industry, transport, and waste? We go through all of these questions, and we don't have the time or perhaps the strength to go through them in detail, but they are very, very open-ended and vague. And so I don't think that we should be answering them directly. We should be thinking about the program. I'm repeating myself now. We should be thinking about the programs that they have and asking what more they should do to provide more clear emissions reductions through the programs, that they are more ambitious and that they have a greater sense of urgency, in my view. I think that I have already summarised that, so I'm just going to jump over it. The document that you received last week expanded the Warmer Kiwi Homes program to deliver an additional 200,000 homes. So there's an example of saying, well, it's all very well what you're suggesting, but you could do more. Secondly, mandate NABERS NZ ratings for all office buildings, hospitals, hotels and retail buildings by June 2023, because at the moment they are restricted to government buildings. So again, it's the additive, and this is the detail from the. That's right. This is a slightly higher level of detail from the draft submission. So there you see again, to repeat, there's the headline recommendations, energy performance certificate, but also added recommendations for new buildings, which is a more aggressive energy efficiency reduction by 2024, 2027 and 2030. And the last document there, I'm going to hand over to Jeff at the moment to comment on these. The last document there, energy efficiency should be first priority for every energy initiative identified in the emissions reduction plan. We have written, this is not the case at present, and I'm sure the authors of this section would react badly to that, but that's what we've written in the submission at the moment. So leaving that slide up, Jeff Smith, do you want to comment sort of broader on how this group can think about doing more, given what the government is already doing, and more into to more clear effect?
Thanks, Toby. Hi, guys. Yeah, look, one of the things I guess I've been thinking about, and hopefully we can collectively think about, is how can we be more tangible with some of these things. There's lots of commentary, and this isn't limited to building and construction. This is across all of the sectors that we're consulting on. But everything's, I guess, kind of woolly and grey, and I think we've got an opportunity here to be quite tangible and say, look, as an example, if we're going to improve 200,000 New Zealand homes, and that's going to result in ABC benefits, and I think being able to tie those two together is really important. It's also going to cost something, and I think that cost piece is important to understand as well. What we've tried to do throughout the built environment piece is to try and be tangible about that. So with NABERS, for example, you might recall in our previous submissions, we've tried to say, hey, look, we want to have X number of businesses, buildings going through a NABERS rating. If we're going to have to incentivize that, we need to create a subsidy of some sort. That's going to cost a certain amount of money. I think those sort of things show that we, I guess, are realizing that, yes, we want to have the good outcome, but also acknowledging that there's going to be some challenges around that cost piece. Going back to the energy efficiency first item, Toby, that's, again, something consistent across everywhere. I've looked at people on the call, and there are many people on the call who are like me, who are professionals working in the space, and we know that there are more opportunities to do more with less. So I guess it's framing up how we can bring that to the front of the conversation to create the focus. And I guess the only other piece I'll throw in there related to new buildings is how can we have a new building piece and then an existing building piece, and perhaps, again, maybe tie them together, or just have some thoughts around that. Obviously, that's where NABERS comes in, but maybe that doesn't reflect the new building piece so much. We haven't talked about, say, Green Star at all in any of our submissions. Maybe that's something we could talk about. But yeah, I guess being more specific is really what I wanted to highlight.
Okay, so thanks, Jeff. So I think that rather than just adhere to Lorette's timing, I think that we should open this to the floor. The only thing I would add before going to the floor is we need to also think about the co-benefits. so improved health and affordability. So we need to think of those when we think of the benefits. And we have so far focused on quantifying the emissions reductions, but if we could find some way to articulate those co-benefits, that would be useful. So I'm going to stop sharing and assume that everyone has read the chapter on building and construction in the consultation document and the chapter on building and construction in the draft submission. And what do you think? How are we going? What more can we do? Look at you, Andrew.
I'll actually kick it off. This is Prageeth
Prageeth.
here from Victor. So
Good.
I'm actually sitting in this more from the energy space, of course, but I used to work in the building sector, so this is of huge interest to me. The two things that were missing that really got me interested was one was the interconnection between especially the residential development sector and electric vehicle infrastructure. There was no discussion that I was aware of where they kind of ensure that all the new built buildings are also electric vehicle friendly. And I think that's quite important. So we can start talking there about things like even like dual metering, because we'll eventually get into a scenario if our kind of mode shift works that not everybody needs a car. So there needs to be that opportunity to have a separate kind of metering system for the vehicle. And then for residents in the area to say, I want that particular meter. So it kind of interconnects all these particular elements, and I didn't see any talk about that. Because I think in the future, our vehicle metering will come from, our bill will not necessarily come from one of the big electricity generators, even though there might be an option, might also come from a current petrol station deliverer if they transition to electricity. So we need to make sure that those options are open.
Prageeth, is there a broader, I'm going to use the term home management system, home energy management system. Is there a, you've mentioned EVs. Is EVs an example of the broader home energy management space, or is a HEMS another thing that you'd add in?
That's another thing. So here I'm just talking about making sure that when in the future, when, in 5 years from now, when somebody wants an electric car, they don't have to retrofit a building that was just built 5 years ago by installing, the charging infrastructure and everything.
Thank you.
The home energy management system is another huge topic for us, of course, as well. So that's the heat, your major loads, right? Your hot water cylinder, your heat pump, and major appliances being able to be internally managed to optimize your costs with hopefully future tariffs that are much more better at interfacing with renewable energy, but at the same time to also then interface with, let's say, Vector and Transpower as well, so that we can optimally manage the network, so we don't need to have enormous increases in infrastructure spend that will increase electricity prices. Rather, things will be managed on that kind of digitalization layer of intelligent home and network management.
What's your take on having homes renewable ready as well, Ricky?
Oh, so solar integration, you mean?
Yeah. So it's like enforcing a wire to solar or whatever that might look like.
Yeah. No, absolutely agree. And not even just wire for solar, right? Even if possible in a dream world, you'd also have a space for battery.
Cool. Yeah, of course.
Something that's currently a temporary outdoor storage cupboard that fits all the safety requirements. So it's easy to just plug it in.
So are all those batteries external to the building? They sit on the wall, do they?
I believe I don't know. Someone in the building sector may have a better understanding of the codes.
Okay. But thematically, where you're going, we get it. Then they're not in there.
No,
that's very
fine.
useful.
So that's two. Those are okay. So you've already covered two parts. I had a third point as well, and that's there's a few limitations of Warmer Kiwi Homes, which we could use this as an addition by saying expand Warmer Kiwi Homes, and there's a few internal issues. So HRV is a Vector company, and they've talked about, like, one of the limitations they had with Warmer Kiwi Homes was they were limited to just servicing Aucklanders, which I found really interesting. I think it was just a bit of a mess up in some sort of design of it. But HRV services heat pumps and HRV systems throughout the whole country. But they, through Warmer Kiwi Homes, people could only choose HRV if they were Auckland residents through the Warmer Kiwi Homes. So there was some weird system that had been set up that we could probably address as well in our submission. Because what this creates is a weird competition, inefficient competition scenario where the customers are not necessarily getting the best effect because they're somehow limited by what suppliers they're allowed to choose from. Yeah, and I think also related to warmer Kiwi homes, this is also something we may want to add, is that ventilation is not part of the system. So it's all about heating. We've talked about LED lighting, which is, I think, a great idea. And at the moment, ventilation is purely air extraction, not whole of home ventilation. And air extraction just basically means get all the air and blow it all outside. Whereas we do know that, especially more on that, this is more talking about the healthy home part, is that the whole, you know, recirculated heat recovery ventilation is really good for people's health. So maybe something
as long as we're
to
not,
consider.
As long as we're not getting into positive pressure stuff, Priggy, I'm supportive. I think, yeah, just simply, we've been making this point for a very long time. You've got the warmer Kiwi homes, and it's to a lower standard than the healthy home standard. What we really need is just consistency right across the sector. And what would be really helpful is a stamp on those so that people can market their homes to that standard. And then what you do is you enable it to be sitting on the limb, so that people, when they're going out to, if they're going to sell, they can see it, and then people who are making the effort can be rewarded. So that's kind of a market incentive play. But absolutely agree. We're doing millions and millions of dollars of work, but we're improving these homes to a standard that's significantly below a given floor that we have for the healthy home standard. So just simpler to, and I think further, what we would suggest is, you know, a great piece of work by Professor Michael Jack is that's all good for slightly improving the bottom rung, but really what we need to start thinking about is a deep strategy for retrofitting our homes to low carbon over time. So how can we look at the examples of the Europe, UK and others who have deep retrofit programs where they're putting billions of dollars into retrofitting their homes to healthier, lower carbon standards. Just some other thoughts. There are market mechanisms available now. I think what's happening is people are building to lower carbon standards, as Jeff said, with Green Star or Homestar or Passive House. But currently they put quite a bit of effort in. There's no material advantage for that. So I know that MB are interested in this, but to say, how about with some sort of incentive, whether that's quicker building consent or lower rates or development contributions. Wellington City Council, they provide 50% off development contributions for buildings that are Green Star. Hamilton City Council for a long time had 2 stories height advantage if you built to a low carbon standard. And these sorts of things will reward people who are leading ahead of the building code changes and helping the sector prepare. Something that might be of help, Toby mentioned the other advantages, so wider benefits to society from these changes. In the document, A Green Recovery, kickstarting a just transition for healthy homes and providing a multi-billion-dollar economic boost, we just set out the advantages for health and for jobs for lower carbon homes and buildings. And really importantly, just for instance, where we go to retrofit thousands and thousands of homes, that can provide hundreds of jobs in regions like Taranaki that might be suffering from reduction in gas extraction. So I think there's potential there. I think there's potential with councils, there's swimming pools, museums, art galleries and libraries. There aren't neighbours tools for those, but there is Green Star Performance, which is like neighbours, but just applicable to other building types. Tens of thousands of people go through those buildings, and if they saw a green rating on the building as they went in, they'd be inspired. You get lower running costs, reducing maintenance and repair and behaviour change. So there's some elements. I do think that what you've got in there is a really good start, and happy to support further.
Thank you, Andrew. Olaf has his hand up, so I'm not going to come back with my questions for you yet. Olaf.
Hi, Olaf here, Bank, Westpac to be precise. A couple of things, so from our perspective, so just for a bit of context, so banks need to measure their emissions, their financed emissions going forward, right? So if we want to, which is critical to direct capital towards more sustainable purposes. So if you bring this into the construction sector and into the building sector, what we were talking about here around the neighbors ratings and Green Star ratings and the likes, and having that recorded on the limb would be critical for us to actually have this, not just have it recorded on the limb, so there's a single source of truth for banks to pick up that information, but also even better if that limb was electronic and you could actually access that data quite centrally, because that would then allow us to recognize which one is brown and which one could be brown to green. And I think having these tools in place will actually really materially support the shift of capital in the residential as well as in the commercial sector. So really strongly support this whole idea of having that stuff centrally recorded and ideally having it electronically available, because having to try to capture our financed emissions, I know how hard it is if you don't have decent data. The other thing that I found that I would really strongly support is around and the ERP sort of touches on it lightly, but I don't think it's going in greater depth. But the whole story of prefabrication, industrially manufactured construction. So I think we have a general question to ask ourselves around the efficiency of the construction sector as a whole, and prefabrication is a great example of it. So really would love to see this being flushed out a little bit more as an opportunity. I've done a bit of renovations on my house, and the amount of time my builder spent driving his Ford Ranger down to Bunnings to get a few screws is just gobsmacking, right? So there is something about the overall efficiency of the construction sector, and because the construction sector, the way it is structured at the moment, bloke in a ute, that's also something that's very difficult for banks to support financially. Whereas if you have a construction sector that is built on hard assets, on machinery that churns out stuff really quickly and efficiently, that's something that banks can get much more behind than at the moment, where the construction sector is mostly cash flow lending or you're supporting developers. The third one I've been thinking a lot about, and this is probably more a question to people that know a lot more about this, but I just can't help trying to connect the dots between exotic forests, bioenergy, and construction. So right now we grow pines, we chop them up, we chop them, we put them on a boat, and we send them to China. So is there something here that is about utilizing the things that we are growing and are soon going to grow more of, and lock that stuff in permanently, the carbon that is, in a more efficient way, in the way we use timber, and then, while at the same time using the offcuts and so on to create bioenergy. So I think there is some biofuel, so there's somewhere in all this, I'd love to see, maybe it exists and I'm just missing it because I'm just a banker, but somewhere in there, I'm looking for somebody talking about a holistic view connecting construction, buildings, biofuel, and forestry. And I think that's a massive opportunity for New Zealand, unless somebody is already doing it and I'm just not seeing it. So those would be my 3 points.
You're my guy, Olaf. That's exactly the piece around that's the piece around the bioeconomy we're talking about.
Is that what it is? Okay, cool.
And no, but you're absolutely right. And it's missing that coordinated piece because, if I reflect on the industrial and process heat side of things that we'll be talking about later on today, there is huge concern in that sector around where they're going to get enough biofuels, i.e. wood, to burn to make their stuff that they make. And at the same time, then you're like, well, actually, we need these wood for the trees and what have you. So there's no cohesive strategy to link in that supply and demand piece. But I completely agree. We've tried to address it, I guess, while maintaining it at a high level. So elsewhere in the document, we talk about that. But yeah, maybe we're at the point where we can probably add some more fat and flesh to that to develop.
Yeah, I think in the narrative about the bioeconomy, you include the role of the construction
Is that
sector.
where it
So
is? Yeah.
I think you beef it up there. But just coming back to Olaf, to your point about the performance of buildings and getting them on the limb. I think the meta point is a very good point. I think the point about getting a central data registry of these things, I think that's probably a bridge too far. Let's focus on the substantial point.
Yeah.
And it echoes some of the themes that Prageeth and Andrew also raised, which is more transparency and more surety about the performance of a building that you're using, buying, or working in. And so that there's, as I go back through the notes from the three of you, there's a number of touch points for that, and we can sort of weave a single narrative around that. I don't see any other hands up yet, but I just want to say we are talking mainly, we've talked a lot about residential, and I'm curious to know whether there's a narrative amongst you all about the commercial builds and also about waste from construction. So this is the idea that when houses or large buildings are retrofit, a new skip is delivered each day and taken off, and God knows what happens to the waste. Well, we know what happens to the waste, don't we? So are there any other comments around what's been raised, or commercial or waste? Matu.
Yeah, good morning. I think, yeah, echoing Prageeth and Olaf's, probably similar things are happening in the commercial space too. So, using transfer as an example, we've got a couple of feasibility studies looking at, driven by embodied carbon, but looking at timber, New Zealand timber source substations. The biggest challenge really is in this kind of council regulation space, building codes, fire rating, that type of stuff. So I guess some flexibility to incorporate some of these changes. But at the moment, you haven't really got any big drivers other than Transfer wanting to go and do the right thing. And we've seen that with a couple of our electricity distribution boards. Unison have done a very good recent substation. They've presented to a number of people, including Prageeth, and huge opportunities in this space to, again, support that local timber market, build these things, in a low carbon, more sustainable way, and still meet a lot of these other requirements too. So certainly good support there.
Thank you. So that's a good steer for putting back into the narrative, Jeff, there as well. Andrew, you're back.
Yeah, thanks for the call regarding office buildings. So two things, I guess. We know that we've had a fourfold increase in uptake of Green Star, and we're seeing, really interestingly, the threshold for people taking it up dropping from 40 to 50 million down to $9 million. So count down all their supermarkets, Goodman's, Panuku Development Auckland, and others are starting at 9. Argosy starting at 9 million now. And the really useful thing on that is it shows us that people can routinely reduce waste going to landfill by 80%. They can also do that when they're carrying out fit outs and refurbishments. And so we would call on government to help set up regional facilities like we have with Green Gorilla and others in Auckland to help that happen. I think that's a really key, they should be using their significant increase in income for that through the waste levy to drive that. I think that's really possible. I also think that we should be calling on councils and government to lead by building to lower carbon. And really specifically, the key area is embodied carbon. So we need a lot more knowledge, a lot more learning, a lot more calculators, and we need the sector to be providing energy performance certificates, EPDs on their products. This is the area that the sector really has to gear up on. 50% of the carbon associated with construction property is from the provision manufacturer of building materials. And how we can help is by understanding and reducing the embodied carbon of concrete, steel and others. And indeed, I would say that government should be supporting concrete and steel to decarbonise with R&D support, that type of thing. It's going to take a huge investment, for instance, for concrete to be providing green concrete routinely.
I'd like to lock this in. Has there been anything written, or does anyone else on the call know where we are in R&D on embodied emissions and what we, SBC CLC, could suggest in terms of gains through better understanding embodied?
Well, is there, or maybe a question for you, Andrew, is there anyone internationally who's doing this much better than us? And are there learnings that we could take elsewhere and pick up and roll with?
Yeah, there are. So we can pick that up and show you overseas examples of far lower carbon concrete and steel. I'm not as close to the R&D or government support for that sort of thing, and that's what I'm getting at. I mean, concrete are talking about needing to go after the pumice extract materials and change their procedures. It's going to take them 8 years and a lot of investment. And I just think we need to be, often embodied carbon gets missed, and we can really help these sectors decarbonise. Yep.
Great.
Well, this is the first time I've heard that said so strongly, that there's a lot to be done. So we'll add that. I can see Barbara Nebel has put her hand up. Barbara, where do you want to jump in?
Well, embodied carbon. So we've done some work together with Andrew and the Green Building Council on what the opportunities are to decarbonize those main building products, including concrete and steel. So I think, Andrew, would you agree that that should be one of the reports and some of the recommendations of that could be included? I think it's about, is it a year ago that we did the report? Year and a half?
Yeah, it is. I'll send through that link. So that shows how concrete and steel and aluminium, we can get lower carbon, those products. Yep.
And I think they're only just starting it out in Australia, but there is it's called MECLA. It's the Material Embodied Carbon Leadership Alliance, and they are pulling together all existing information on embodied carbon and really hoping to have more of a framework on how to address it. And I thought that was quite interesting because, relatively speaking, it's not yet as much of an issue. Absolutely speaking, of course it is, but relatively speaking, because of their grid, they need to also decarbonize the grid first. They're here in relative terms, as Andrew said, embodied carbon is about 50% of the environment's contribution. And we're just updating that figure now in a report for MB as well. So that should be coming out very soon.
Yeah.
We've got Marty who wants to come back.
Yeah, sorry about that. Again, I think that electricity sector has done a fair bit of work in this. So we've got together, we've done some pilots around embodied carbon, and again, I think we've used this Mott McDonald Moata tool and been presented to the sector. So some really good synergies for our sector, because some of our big infrastructure is probably 80, 85, 90% in carbon and steel. But again, you're forging your own path. There's no guidance from government in this space, so getting some guidance across maybe the residential and commercial sector would be very useful.
Okay, so getting no guidance from government, that sounds like fertile ground for this exercise. Matthew, given the amount of renewable electricity we already have in this country, and this issue of relativity, how much, if we were to headline gains to be made around this area, is there some decent scale? I mean, is there? How do we quantify if we were serious about our embodied emissions, both for new building and for retrofitting? Is there a big gain to be made?
Pretty substantial. I think some of our measurements, Prageeth might back up on this one, but I think we're looking at your typical substation would be in the order of, say, 30,000 tonnes of CO2 embodied carbon. And at the moment, there's this, we can measure, we can understand that, but what does a company like Transpower do with this? Do you wear it on your greenhouse gas reporting? Do you kind of, do you run it down, depreciate it over a number of years when you've got such long assets? But again, it's this really developing world that we don't know a lot about. But I think the big risk at the moment is there's a few organisations that are actually measuring and trying to understand this. But it really is, it's typically those well-funded, well-resourced parts of the sector. So I think you'd see similar movements from Vector. You'd probably Meridian wanting to understand the embodied carbon of wind farms. Auckland Transport and Watercare are trying to do similar things. But again, it's what does that, once you've got that information, what do you do with it? And what sort of are the incentives to drive that stuff down? And a big challenge for Transpower, one of our biggest issues is decarbonising New Zealand. Transpower will ultimately be wearing a lot of that, carbon through grid upgrades, new substations, grid exit points, etc. So it will be a very high carbon story for Transpower. So we're really trying to incentivise those opportunities to look for low carbon steel, low carbon concrete, and so huge support there.
Yeah, exactly. So this often gets missed and it gets lost because I'm just going to show you something. It might help. Can you see that?
Yep.
Can you see that, Toby?
Perfect.
So this is the work. This is the work that Barbara and her team, Jeff, did so well. So where we can, their take was we can drive down embodied carbon emissions in that they have short-term and then longer-term strategies, but that is equivalent to 460,000 cars off the road. I'll send that report through, but there's those steps that we can take right now and that's before even considering substitution. So substitution is where you take timber instead of concrete or timber instead of steel. So happy to share that, but it's quite considerable, and it's really great to draw that connection through to decarbonising. Happy to share that, and that is within the next 10 years. That kind of time frame there.
Okay, so Jeff, is what I was going to ask you how we get our arms around this for this exercise. Is what Andrew's just shown, is that the sort of thing that we're going to be able to use to show?
Yeah, I think so. So in the last submission that we did to the Climate Change Commission as CLC, we had a commentary on embodied emissions.
Yep.
So what I think we do is we utilise, Andrew, if that's okay, the documentation that yourself and Barbara pulled together as, I guess, a supplementary piece there. But I guess what I'm really interested in there is the fact that you've got a heap of numbers that can show the tangible difference, which is the thing that's of interest. Previously, it was much harder for us to say, this is the difference we can possibly make. But I think that's the stuff that we really need to take forward. Cool. So thank you for sharing that.
Excellent.
Yeah, I've put a link into the chat box to the report.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure whether Matthew's hand is an old hand or a new hand, but just while Matthew sorts that out, does anyone else want to jump in either and pick up any of the themes, and you can see where we're going, or is there anything else that you want to raise while we have this discussion?
I did still have my hand up. I also wanted to say before, there was a comment that government wasn't actually providing much guidance. There was actually a big working group in MB, the Building for Climate Change program, which does have a big focus on embodied carbon as well. I think that should be just noted. So there is actually something happening there.
Well, Barbara, let's just clarify. What exactly is that?
The Building for Climate Change program.
Yeah, what's the working group?
There's a link put in the comment that Belinda's attached, Toby. So perhaps is that what you're referencing to, Barbara?
Oh yes, that is exactly the one. Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
and so we
Yeah.
learn about who it is and what it's doing and what its mandate is through that link. Okay, thank you. It's always good to know these things when we start writing about them, so that when people say, "Oh, they're doing that over there," so that's thank you, Barbara. Helen Jenkins.
That people have been.
Helen, we've got neither.
At all.
Right.
Apologies, folks. Do you have sound now?
We have sound now, Helen.
Right. So, firstly, yeah, completely support the importance of EPDs and the carbon that's locked into building materials being a huge part of the picture. We'd see that as pretty intimately linked to the move to more modern methods of construction. So, designing in digital, building off site. So it'd be good to see in the document sort of the linkages that, all of the data about what's locked into products, the data about, how you can construct more efficiency with lower waste is really all part of what should be the approach to construction. I would imagine starting with commercial and infrastructure construction, starting with the bigger projects, it's really all part of the same joined up approach, and just using, I guess, getting data out of construction on waste and embodied carbon, but also using that data much more effectively. So I think building off-site and modern methods of construction, they're really well informed by EPDs, and it's hard to know that you've made the right decisions without both pieces of the data picture. So that was, yeah, if we can weave that theme into the submission, I think we'd be very supportive of that thinking.
Okay. Okay. Prageeth's back.
I'm back. Yeah, I just want to follow up from something Matthew and then Barbara also said, and a note I made. If it is true that the MB is working on creating this kind of embodied emissions guidance, it may not be a bad idea for us to just give them a pat on the back and say, hey, we do really need this, keep it as a priority, because the thing I absolutely love about the Ministry for the Environment's Guide to Emissions is it suddenly enabled all of industry to do a really good greenhouse gas internal calculation and start setting all these thresholds. And that was all enabled by this really good work from the MFE. And we don't currently have that with embodied emissions, at least to the best of my knowledge. So Matthew and I, for example, are doing quite a lot of work, consulting out with a lot of organizations. We need to put down quite a bit of money. And we're doing this just because it's a good thing to do, right? So this is in the corporate financial world, this sometimes ends up becoming a bit complicated to do long term. Fortunately, we have good board and executive governance, but not every company does. So the ability for MFE to be able to kind of step in and say, you don't need to pay Barbara. Sorry, Barbara, as much as we love your organization. You can just follow this guide and actually work it out yourself and then be able to report and then reduce upon that. And I think that would be really a really good enabler and lever for industry to then start making embodied emissions calculations and then use that to then further reduce.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, Prageeth. And one of the note I've made here is don't let the good get in the great get in the way of the good. And what I mean by that is there's been lots of conversations about doing embodied emissions across, I guess, that sort of sector. But I guess what made the MFE stuff so good, the current guide, I should say, is that they're just throwing some numbers out there, and some of them aren't quite right, and it's not applicable for everybody, but you're all working from the same sort of field. So let's get something out there to start with, and even if it's not quite right, the quantas are going to be right, because wood's going to be really, really low, steel and concrete are going to be really, really high, and that's the stuff that's really, really important. So I completely agree with you there.
I think it also connects up with the incentives.
Yep.
So people spending the extra time, effort, and money to do these things, if they get $1,000 off per home off their development contributions or faster consent, then you're going to see 20% of people projects doing that, and then you change the market. Just worth noting, there are those calculators available in both Homestar and Greenstar if that's useful, and Prageeth, I'd welcome your feedback on the new one for Homestar. So do feed in.
Yeah, I also think that's a really great point, Prageeth. Also from the perspective of what I think that we should also consider adding in there is, I like the idea of encouraging good action that they're already taking. So I think that if we say that we understand that this work is already being carried out, but also add in the line there along the lines of we would welcome any opportunity to further engage with them on the development of this. And then hopefully we can provide an extra opportunity where we can come together and discuss this more in depth with them. Yeah.
Kathleen's put the Green Recovery Report in the chat. Okay. Olaf, are you back? Is that a new hand?
Yes, it's a new one. Just earlier, you know how you said about a national database is probably a step too far. Agree with that, but I'm trying to jog my memory of conversations I had with the Department of Internal Affairs around LIM templates and the development of national templates. So if you had a national template and the discussion so far has been very much around adaptation and about exposure to natural hazards, but you can extend that same kind of thinking and say, well, if we had a national template, it also captured the energy efficiency of a property in a common language through ratings, and if those then were digitally available, then you don't need a centralized database because you just get a data aggregator to extract that stuff and pull it together. So we don't need to ask for a database. We just need to reference the work that's going on around creating a national LIM template and attach to it relevant energy efficiency information for a building. So if, for example, a rating was mandatory, then it should be on the LIM, and that then makes it accessible to everyone. And if it's digital, you can mine that and get it.
Excellent. It's an excellent suggestion.
So I just need to do a bit of digging on that, where that project is at, but I can do that. Sorry?
And Olaf, just because it might help Toby and Jeff and others, Laurie, make the point, but we're already doing that through Velocity. So
yeah,
Homestar homes are listed against their address, sent to Velocity electronically, and then they're releasing that to property websites and to councils who want to list it on the LIM. And Hutt City Council is listing which homes in their region have homes that are Homestar. Christchurch City Council want to do that, and New Plymouth City Council also want to take that ahead. So just if you wanted an example, happy to share.
Yeah, and that's just having that consistency national-wide. I know several councils are looking at something similar, and then you can easily extract that for the likes of Velocity. So that would make a huge difference, and that would actually give the banks a lot to play with, because we all work with the likes of Velocity and CoreLogic.
Excellent. Okay, Jeff, how are we going in terms of beefing up the existing narratives?
I've made a lot of notes. There's lots of good written. Look, I can you go just in your presentation? Was there any areas that we haven't touched on, Tony?
We haven't done energy performance certificates explicitly, and that's something that jumps onto these things and jumps off. Is that still something we should be pursuing, or are these other ideas actually more on point?
I mean, I think we're kind of a level down from that in terms of our conversation.
Yeah. Okay. And at some stage we have to go through all of these. That may not be the right presentation. At some stage we have to go through all these questions and sit down with Lorette and work out whether we're actually going to go through them all and provide an answer, or whether we're going to frame up the submission around the additive initiatives.
I do have one question, and I guess I'm going to be in the weeds a little bit, but there was discussion previously around the role that gas has to play in the residential sector. I think from our side and where previously we were pretty keen to get gas away from that. There was going to be a need for gas in some more troublesome areas, and maybe to your point, Andrew, that could be things like steel production and what have you to say remove coal in the medium term. Is there any strong feeling from the group around not having that? So to sort of say, look, we don't think gas in the residential sector is the right use for that fuel.
Yeah, so if you look at the screen, Jeff, the issue of fossil fuel use in and around building construction and building use that is picked up on question 72 and 73.
Yeah.
So
I'm just confused about do we want to be strong in our language around the role of gas in the residential sector moving forward?
Yeah, that is an excellent question to ask this group.
How big is the issue, Olafia? Because I sort of got the sense from the Climate Change Commission, the draft and then also the final one, it sort of became a bit of a red flag. A lot of people were piling in on it, and I always wondered whether it actually, is it really so big from an emissions profile, or is it just something that people rub themselves up against? Honest question. I simply don't know.
Fair, and I don't have the number in front of me either, but where I am landing is that there's a much greater need for gas for higher temperature uses, and so I'm trying to think about where the gas could be best used in the short term that we're going to have gas as part of our energy mix, and almost all of the energy required from a residential perspective is at low temperature, just for space heating and a bit of water heating, and you can comfortably do that with technology available now that is electrically fired, so heat pumps and what have you.
So in other words, it would be better to send the gas to Huntly.
Well, yeah, but in terms of footprint improvement and on a NZ Inc. perspective, that could be where we go. But I guess, it's something a little bit. Again, reflecting on what we're going to have in the industrial section later on, I'm pushing to have a ban on new coal boilers. Maybe there's a similar strongly worded approach here around actually we don't think there's a role for gas in the residential market beyond a certain time frame.
Absolutely agree.
That's the question for this group. Do you want to go in hard the way that Jeff has said? Or does anyone not want to go in hard and say gas out of these uses where there are viable alternatives? I think you're getting a mandate, Jeff, to go in hard.
Brigithe's got his hand up. Go, Brigitte.
Hello.
Brigitte
yes,
definitely go in hard.
So I have a finger in a gas business. So I am very. We need to really strongly push for a transition away from fossil gas, without question. Where we do have concern, not from the gas business, more from the electricity business, is that at the moment we're already, like, at least within our network scale, we're already quite maxed out in terms of kind of our electricity demands in certain areas, and every upgrade or change in the current system requires us to do an extensive network upgrade. Now, just to put in perspective, our network, if we were to put the lines back to back, is the length from New Zealand to the UK. That's how long our network is. It's gigantic. So doubling that or adding on the capacity, because hot water is about half an energy load, ends up resulting in quite extensive upgrades. So while we definitely say we want to transition, we don't want that transition to be a sudden step change, because that is not, a sudden ban on gas, for example, residentially, is not going to be a really fun time for us. And our gas peak lines up exactly on our electricity peak. So kind of to Olaf's point as well, I don't know if that's what you were hinting at, Olaf, that just basically means that we need additional peak power electricity at that time. So kind of just doing a bit of thinking on this. The other thing is that gas has an emission intensity in residential use of about 200 grams per kilowatt hour because it's used as direct heating, whereas gas used in electricity generation has an emission factor of 500 grams per kilowatt hour because it has the conversion efficiency, then coal is about 1,000. Electricity in the North Island is around 150. So I think the journey to transition out residential gas was not thought out in terms of how are we reducing emissions, but rather it seems like an easy, tangible thing to do. So I think when we prepare our submission back, it's really important to say, yes, I mean, it's a fossil fuel, we have to transition out of it, but just make sure we hit the big ticket items first, like coal at 1,000 grams per kilowatt hour.
That was my point.
Not put ourselves at a risk of transitioning out of very low emission factor energy usage and risk actually counterbalancing it with a very high emission usage point.
Yeah, I completely hear where you're coming from.
It's fine. Yeah.
And I guess again, just thinking where I'm trying to get to is looking across the industry, I guess, as a whole. Yeah, you're right. There's going to be challenges around your network long term, medium term, I should say, as you adjust to providing more electricity. The other option is that we push harder into the green gas side of things and look to alternatives to the gas network. But all the numbers I've seen indicate that the amount of gas we will get from renewable sources is going to be significantly less than we have in the network currently. So I think there's going to end up being a price point where it's going to be difficult for residential customers to pay for this anyway. But I take your point.
Yeah, and actually, in fact, we still haven't quite got the numbers right, but my gut feeling is that we will need to decrease our gas consumption to enable the kind of renewable gases to meet up into that nice little middle point.
Yeah, cool.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm just noticing that we're at time now. Just before I wrap up, I just want to pick back on Toby's point. You asked about whether we need to address every specific question. And so I think the idea is that we don't necessarily need to address every specific question, but rather provide an overarching response for each of the sections that is laid out in the ERP. However, what I would say to all of you that are on the call today, if there are specific questions that you do want addressed, please flag that with us, and then we'll ensure that there is at a minimum a direct response within the section to that. So that would be the key points, and then I'll pass to you in a second, Toby, just to hand over. But before I do, I just want to remind everybody that we also have another number of other workshops today, which is there's a cross-cutting workshop, and then there is there's an equitable transitions in energy and resources workshop for this afternoon as well. So would welcome any of your dialogue along and participation along at those workshops as well. And I'll just pass over to Toby, and just in case he has any closing comments that he wants to give from the session today.
Great to see you all. Thanks very much for your lively input. We'll write it up and look forward to hearing from you again.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Great work. Kia kaha. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks all.
Bye, everyone.